Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Teaching with GIS, a Modelled Lesson. If you haven't met me before, my name is Jacob Lovejoy. I'm a registered teacher in Queensland and I'm currently the Education Program Manager at Esri Australia. I've included my email address as well as LinkedIn if you'd like to connect with me in either of those ways, and I've also included the URL to our school's website, which hosts a range of learning materials and professional development resources that you can access at any time. And I'd encourage you to check that out, and I'll show you where to find some of the resources that we're essentially talking to and unpacking in this webinar today. So what is the purpose of this webinar? Largely the audience in this webinar is teachers that have been put on an onboarding journey, so teachers that have recently joined via the ArcGIS Schools Bundle program. And throughout those weekly emails, you would have been exposed to, if you've been keeping up, skills like how to clean your data, how to import data and style it in ArcGIS Online, where to look for complementary feature layers, and if we have time today, we'll look at creating a choropleth map. So in order to achieve those four things and review those four things, we're going to walk through it as if it was a basic lesson activity we were running with our students. So hopefully you'll find this a little bit useful for your upcoming assessment, and feel free to just chuck questions in the question box as we go, and I'll try and address them as we proceed. So to set the context for this lesson, I've come up with a little bit of a blurb. We're currently undergoing our Year 12 assessment task, and I know that for Queensland teachers, this is on par with what they're doing. So if you're outside of Queensland, my apologies. I'm just based in Queensland, so I'm a little bit more across what the Queensland teachers are currently doing. But we're currently undergoing our Year 12 assessment task, which is a data report for Unit 4, Managing Population Change. This assessment is for Topic 1, Population Change in Australia. And the task, as outlined in the task sheet, is to select one location in Australia and identify a demographic challenge for this location. Proposed actions for managing this demographic challenge must also be raised and justified. The task specifies that geospatial technologies must be fully integrated into the response. And I understand, after having a look at quite a few task sheets from different Queensland schools, that the focus is essentially the same. Well, the task is essentially the same, and the use of geospatial technologies being fully integrated is essential as well to the task. Really, the only difference between the school assessments is the locations that students can focus on for their assessment. So we've collected some data, and we're looking to clean this data so that it's suitable for use in ArcGIS Online, so that we can essentially map it in ArcGIS Online. So let's get started with step 1. And I'm going to jump over to a spreadsheet where my data set is. So I'll just drag that across for you. So this is data that I've grabbed from the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It shows in 10-year age groups, the number of people per statistical area 2. And this is just for Queensland. I can get this data for any SA2 area in Australia. It's just that the data set was so big that I just reduced it to Queensland. As you can see, if I scroll down to the bottom, I've got 538 SA2 areas in Queensland alone. So I just want to reduce how big this spreadsheet was going to be. And in order to clean our data, this data is really great, but we need to clean it up a little bit so that ArcGIS Online can read the file and can essentially map this data for us. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove excess columns and excess rows. And I always like to encourage students when I'm visiting schools that these 8 or so rows, we don't want them for our spreadsheet, but the information in them is probably important to protect or keep or record somewhere else. So I encourage students to maybe make a separate Word document called bibliographic details or something like that. So they can copy this information in across there, and they've got that for when they need to build a bibliography, or when they need to revisit what this data set is actually showing. So let's pretend that we've done that, and we're going to essentially remove these rows from our spreadsheet. And this is an image, so we actually have to physically remove the image too. And I can see that there's a couple of extra rows in here that I also want to remove. So I'm going to remove this column here, and we're going to change and get rid of column A. And I'm going to bring SA2 up to here so that I can get rid of this empty row, because this row doesn't show anything except this title. So I might as well bring this title up to the top column so it's in line with my other titles, and I can delete that. And if I was you, I wouldn't worry too much about what's bold and what's not, because ArcGIS Online doesn't really care for that too much. Now, the next thing I need to do is I like to visit the bottom of my data set, and you can see that there's often some extra, there's either footnotes or some extra notes that often appear in spreadsheets that you grab from online sources. So if those footnotes are important, again, the same, I guess, advice applies. Maybe your students need to copy and paste that into the referencing document so that they can recall that at a later time if they need to. In this case, this particular comment doesn't really bear any weight, so we're just going to delete that as well. And you might look at this data set and go, hey, if I'm only looking at one or two, maybe 3 or 4 SA2 areas, you could actually go through and clean out all of the rows to really reduce the size of the data set. And also I'll point out little things like these last rows. If you're not after a total of how many kids between 0 to 9 years exist in Queensland across all SA2s, you don't actually need these total rows. You don't need no usual, which I would say is no usual place of residence or something like that as of census night, and migratory data. So if you don't need those rows, you can actually, again, also clean it up with the delete button. I'm going to leave the total column for this side though, because it might be of interest to know how many people are living within Alexandra Hills, for instance, if that was my focus area. Now, the next thing we need to do after we've cleaned up our rows and columns a bit is to just fix our column headers. So ArcGIS Online can't read column headers if they have spaces in them, and that can be frustrating. And the way around it is to either remove the space or chuck in an underscore to reflect that there is a space there. I'm a fan of the underscore. It just makes it easier for my eyes to read. Another way to do it is if you've got multiple words in your column header, you might capitalize each word but have no spaces between, and then that capital serves as an easy way to tell that you've got multiple words in that heading. So excuse me while I get through all of these headings. And I thought that we would work with this example today because, again, there's a lot of schools that I'm aware of that are currently undergoing an assessment piece like this. So I thought population data might be a bit more appropriate to what we're looking at. And there we go. So we've formatted our headers, our column titles, so that there's no gap between, or no space between any of them. The other thing I like to point out to students as well is sometimes when you download a data set, you've got zeros, or you might have forward dashes, or you might actually have blank space. And I like to just explain to them the difference between the two. So we can't, if our data is 0, we can't actually have a forward slash, I don't know why it's not letting me go in, a forward slash in there because ArcGIS Online doesn't recognize that special character. So we need to actually physically make sure that zeros are zeros if our data was blank, I like to explain to students, just because a cell is blank doesn't mean that it equates to 0. It might mean that there is no data available for that area. And so we're going to leave it as blank. And we're not going to populate it with things that we don't know. So I like to specify that too. In this case, it is 0. And you need to just make sure, depending on the data sets you're working with, that your locations are spelt correctly. So if you're manually entering these SA2 areas for whatever reason, and you spell Murray with only one R, you're going to have problems when ArcGIS Online tries to find that place for you because it's spelled incorrectly. So just making sure that you're accurately entering that information too. Now, once we're happy with our data set, the next thing that we need to do is we need to save it as a CSV. So we're going to go to Save As, and by default, when you're working in Excel, it'll want to save it as an XLSX document. All we need to do is click on that and find CSV, and you can notice that there's actually a fair few CSV types. I think on MacBook it might actually appear as comma delimited, which you can see there. And I always just choose CSV comma delimited by default anyway. And I'm going to rename this data to population in 10-year brackets. I'm going to, might chuck in 2016. I'm going to hit save. And I'm going to save it to my OneDrive, sorry, and I'm going to hit save. And it will just come up. Sometimes it comes up with a warning. When you save a CSV file, you can't have multiple sheets. So if you had multiple sheets with different data sets on them, you actually need to have separate CSV files or separate documents. So it's just checking that. To save only the active sheet, click OK. Well, this is my only active sheet, so I'm okay with that. I'm going to hit OK there. You can see it's renamed it. And I'll just save that again, and I'll close that down. So we've cleaned our data, and we're going to now import that data. And well, we won't style it just yet, but we'll import it into ArcGIS Online. So let's head over to ArcGIS Online. I'm going to have to refresh this because I've timed out. And we're just loading in, or logging in, sorry, to our school's ArcGIS account. We're going to head to Map. And again, just a reminder, feel free to ask questions as we go. I do have the question box open on my screen. So in a new map, this is what my map looks like. I want to add that file that I just saved. So I can click Add in the top corner, Add Layer from File, and I can go searching for it. You can also drag the file in as well. So if I go to my OneDrive, sorry, it's a bit of a mess, and I'm looking for population in 10-year brackets. I'm going to hit Open there. Now I will, before I hit Import Layer, just want to point out that ArcGIS can only accept certain types of documents. So you can see that CSV is one of those documents, which is why we changed it from XLSX to CSV. You could also do the same thing and build your data in a text file. I'm personally not a fan of text files. I think just for me, and probably for students as well, the fact that Excel has nice columns and rows and nice lines separating everything is just a really good visual tool to help make sure that you enter your data accurately. So I'm going to import layer. And if I was working with, if my location data, which is stored in my SA2 field in my spreadsheet, was actually a place, then I could choose how I want, sorry, if I'm addresses or places, I could choose how I want ArcGIS to map that data. But because SA2s themselves, statistical areas, aren't necessarily a physical location or a recognized location, we're actually going to add it as a table, and we will map it later by bringing in a boundary layer. And I'll show you how to do that. That's the process of creating a choropleth map. But instead, if we were looking at things like maybe this was country, and we were looking at African countries, then we would change this to world. I'm just going through the process so you can see, and I could choose country from the list, but it has to be a recognized location. So it can be an address, it can be a neighborhood, it can be a city, suburb, etc. And SA2 isn't necessarily a recognized location. So we're going to add it as a table for now. And we can see that that table has been added here. We're not going to be able to see the data yet because we need to bring it, join it to a boundary layer that exists. So let's do that now. We're going to hit add again, and this time instead of adding from our files, we're going to search for what's available in ArcGIS Online. I'm going to swap from my content over to ArcGIS Online. I'm going to type in Australia boundaries, and these boundary layers are awesome for joining your spreadsheet data to a map. So we can see here, I've got state boundary lines, postcodes, country, so that's just the whole of Australia as a boundary. But then I've got statistical area 1, 4, 3, and 2. And because we're working with statistical area 2 data, I want to add this one to the map. It might take a moment to add, but all this data is essentially showing are the boundaries of each SA2 in Australia. And we have in our table SA2 data for population for our Queensland region. So what we want to do is we want to join these two layers so that we can see our population trends on the map. So in order to do that, we're going to hit analysis. I always go to say analyze. Analysis, and under summarize data, we're going to join features. So that's where we're joining our two layers together. And we want our target layer to be the boundaries layer. So the green on the map. So we're going to select that feature layer. And we want our join layer to be our table, which is our population and 10-year bracket. So this is what I named the table before. And because we add it as a table, we want to click on the table option. And we want to choose how we're going to join these two features. So if I just open up an SA2 area in Queensland, you can see that the SA2 name, Far Southwest, I want to join that to my spreadsheet. So if I open, I'm going to open my spreadsheet back up so we can actually see where this is. It's not in alphabetical order, so we'll have to go far south. And if I expand that, we can see that in my data set, I actually have a Far Southwest as a place, an SA2 in my data set. So for return here, I want to join this name on this boundary layer. So I'm going to click here, target field name to SA2 in my table. And I'll just show you again on my data. We know that all my SA2 names are sitting underneath the SA2 heading. So that's how I know what column to select. So I've got my two fields, and now I'm just going to scroll down. I'm going to leave step 4 as default. I might choose to rename this layer. I'm just going to call it webinar choropleth, and that's because I'll just delete it later for me. And I'm going to untick use map extent and run analysis. Now you'd come up with an appropriate, or your students would come up with more of an appropriate result name. But what it's essentially doing is it's combining this feature layer, so the green that we see here, which I can toggle on and off, with our table that we brought in. It might take a minute or two to do that, but once it does, we will have population data displayed for each SA2 in Queensland. Are there any questions while we do wait for the analysis? Can take a couple of minutes depending on the size of the data set. So if there are any questions at this stage, it might be a good time to just chuck them in the question box. You can imagine that if we were working with SA2 data for all of Australia, then this analysis process is going to take a lot longer because the data set's a lot bigger. So we can see that it's finished here. It's going to pop up on the map, and I'm going to turn the green layer off. So you can see that doesn't turn blue everywhere because we don't have data for everywhere. We only have data for Queensland. So I can turn that off, or better yet, I don't actually need this data layer anymore, so I can remove it. And you might be thinking, well, this is great. It's all been mapped, but it's all blue. That's not really a choropleth, and we can change that so it begins to take an appearance. You can see, however, that I've got population details in 10-year brackets that I sourced myself from the ABS for Far Southwest. We can see that. So let's turn this into a choropleth map. If we hover over our title here, sometimes you have to click on it depending on your computer, and you'll see a range of different tools appear beneath. And we want to choose the third one across, the change style icon. I always call it the shapes icon. And we want to change it from show location only. So we want to change the attribute being shown. That's why it's all blue at the moment. It's just showing the location of the SA2s. If we change this, let's say we were interested in 0 to 9 years, how many of the population is from 0 to 9 years? And it will try and change our drawing style to counts and amounts size, which is circles. For some assessment tasks or for some data types, proportional circles might be a really great way to display data. For this one, where statistical areas aren't recognized as proper locations, it's not the best tool for the job. So if we change it from counts and amounts size to counts and amounts color, we're going to return to that choropleth look. So we select that, and we can see that a really nice choropleth is beginning to form. And I can click on options here, and I can actually make some decisions about how I want to classify this data. And this is something I stress to teachers and students as well. I believe that the Queensland criteria specifies that they need to create sophisticated cartographic forms or sophisticated maps. And little decisions like how you're going to separate your classes, so you're going to separate it via natural breaks, equal intervals, etc. They come into a bit of the decision-making process and reflect whether your map might be considered sophisticated or not. And decisions like how many classes are you going to have to display your data might also be another decision that reflects sophistication. So those decisions, I do stress them to students because they are important. If we play with our classes for a second, and I can physically change my classes up here as well, but if I had 3 classes sitting up here, and this gray histogram, if you turn this on its side, this is essentially a histogram. This is showing us where our data is actually sitting. So if I've got 3 classes up here, that's not very sophisticated because this data these classes aren't actually showing any data. So it's about showing them, I guess, unpacking this so that they make a good decision as to how their classes are being separated. So we'll go with 6 classes, and because I've classified my data, I can now make some changes to the legend. So I could actually physically click on each of these colors and choose a different progression if I wanted to in colors. If I wasn't really happy with the blues, I could change it, or I always like to click on the symbols icon. And we've got some nice color schemes there too. So let's go with maybe maroon, and you can see that that's applied to the map. Now, in order to save these changes, all we've got to do is hit OK and then hit done to lock them in. And I always encourage students after that to then hover over the layer again. And we want to find the 3 dots at the end. And we want to rename it. So we know that this data is now showing 0 to 9 year olds, population of 0 to 9 year olds by SA2. So it's important to rename your data to reflect what it's actually being shown. But let's say I wanted to use this layer again to show a different attribute, I can do so. So again, I can hover over it, I can click on the 3 dots, I can actually copy it. I've got a copy here. Let's rename this one to, let's say we're interested in, instead of 0 to 9, we're interested in aging population this time. So let's go 60 to 69. We'll remove the copy off the end. And we hit OK, and we go through the same process. We click on the shapes icon. Actually, I might turn our 0 to 9 years off for a second. We click on the shapes icon and we just change the attribute being shown. So I'll look for my 60 to 69 years, which is here. And it will change it back to circles probably. So we just need to make sure we choose counts, amounts, color. And we can go through the same process. And I would always encourage students to, hey, if you're showing different data this time around, make sure you choose a different color scheme. So I haven't classified the data yet, which is why it looks a bit different, but let's choose a different color scheme this time so that we can easily distinguish between our data sets. So you can essentially copy this layer as many times as you want to display as many attributes as you have. Now I do have a question here. I did see it come through. Maxine, so you missed the first few minutes. Where did you get the data? Really great question. You can get this data via the ABS. So this is data I sourced from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I'll just show you because I like to keep records of where I can find stuff. There's this really great tool called Census Table Builder. Now, I wouldn't encourage, unless you've got lots of time for your students, it can be a little bit, I guess, difficult to build tables, but you can actually build. So if I click on 2016 census and population, I always choose Census Table Builder Basic. And then let's say I'm interested in employment, income, and education. I click on that and it gives me a catalog of items that I can look at. So if I was interested in employment by occupation, I click on that and I click new table. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I can then begin to build a table from the census data on how I want it to look. So if I'm working at SA2 area, SA2 scale, I can click on geographical areas. I find my statistical area structure here. I'll drag this column out and click on the down, and I can select SA2. Now I've selected that. Actually, I might go a bit further. So I'll remove that selection if I can. I might have to add it and then remove it, but I probably shouldn't have added it as just SA2 because it's going to try and add all the SA2s from every state. And you can see that it's taken quite some time. So I should have actually opened this up, selected Queensland, and then SA2. So you can see I've got SA2s. This will scroll forever because it'll have SA2s for every area in Australia. And then it's essentially about building this table out to reflect what I want it to display. So if I'm interested again, I've done with my geographical areas. Now I'm interested in education and qualifications. I just keep opening up folders until I see what I want. Okay, I'm interested in full-time students, and I add that to the map, to the table. And then once you're done, it's just a matter of exporting that via the Go button at the top. So that's where I got the data from. It does take some time to get your head around how to build a table. And like I said, if you don't have the time with the students, it might be that you're building some initial data sets that you distribute to your students for them to then build off and locate their own. So I think I added it wrong there, but I probably should have added it as row instead of column. But that's where I got it from, Census Table Builder. It's a really good tool, but it does take some time to get your head around. So I'm going to close that for now. So I've got my two population areas there. If we head back to our, and you can see this is something I stress with students all the time. You can see that I've got both layers on, but I can only see the top one. So something I like to stress to students is order of layers is really important. So if I drag that up to the top, if it would come up to the top, or maybe I need to drag this one underneath. There we go. If I drag that one underneath, I can see that my data set changes as to what's being displayed. And for something like this, these two data sets, you're probably not going to have them both on at the same time. But depending on what you're showing, it's sometimes useful to have a data set over the top of another data set. So that's something to consider. But for now, I'm going to turn them off. I'm just going to go back to here. So what we've actually done so far is we've cleaned some data. we've imported it, and now we've styled it. But before we styled it, we actually created a choropleth map, and that was through that analysis function. So the next step for us to do, or to approach with our students in class, would be to find complementary layers. What other data exists out there that might be useful for their assessment? So let's return to ArcGIS Online. And if we hit add and go back to search for layers, I'm just going to remove my search term. We can see that there's 667 layers for Australia boundaries. If I remove that search term, we've got over 10,000 layers sitting in ArcGIS Online that might be of use for us. Depending on what your topic is, things like terrain, or I think this elevation, there's different things for different topics. So you just need to consider what's available for you. Because we're looking at demographics, or Australian demographics, let's type in Australia demographic and we hit enter. We can see that we've got 43 layers here. And I'm not going to spend too much time, but I've shown you how to bring in your own data. There's actually data that exists from the 2011 census that's in here. So instead of me bringing in my own data and wasting my time, I could have brought in an existing like Australia population 65 and over. So it's always good to check what's available. The reason I didn't do that straight off the bat is because you'll see that these all have little red symbols next to them. They're currently, here. This item is in mature support and will be retired of June this month. So this month in 2021. So I didn't want us to rely too heavily on this because it is being removed soon. The reason it's being removed is because it's 2011 data, and I believe towards the end of June, this data will disappear and will be replaced by 2016 data. So the census data, some really great census data is going to be made available, and you can see how many layers are being depreciated and retired. But a lot of them are being replaced as well. So don't be disheartened. There is, I guess, essentially just more updated data coming in. This one's always a good one, Australia annual beer spending. But so there's data for them to look at there. There are two data sets that aren't being retired at the moment, and they're these two here. So Australia purchasing power per capita and Australia average household size. We can click on the title and it tells you a little bit about it. So this layer shows the average household size in Australia in 2020 on a multi-scale map. So as I scroll in and out on my map, the data will change depending on what statistical area or focus I'm at. So let's have a look at this in action. I mean, we're probably not too interested in necessarily household size, but there's some really great data that sits in this. This title's a little bit misleading. So you can see that I've actually got other information I can see. So I'll go back to details and we'll just watch the legend change. So at the moment, we're at a state scale. And as I zoom in, just watch that word state change. So we'll stay in Queensland. So we're at statistical area 4, 3, and we can see the data changes. Local government areas, if you're working at LGAs. Let's go to Southeast Queensland because it's a bit busier. We scroll in, we've got our stat 2s, and then if we scroll right into a region, we get our stat 1s. So this is I guess a really good tool, a really good data set for students to particularly look at what's happening within an SA2 boundary layer. I'll just bear with me, I'm just going to bring in an SA2 outline so it's a little bit clearer for us. So I'm just going to drag in, it's essentially all this is an outline of Cooloola. And it will just help us visualize where our data is. So I'm just going to make it an outline. So no fill, I have a strong black outline. Unfortunately, I don't know why it doesn't allow us to set a width, but if I hit OK, I can see my nice SA2 boundary so that when I actually zoom in, to an SA1 level for my data. Once it loads, sorry. I might actually have to change the scale as well. That's all right. I can change the visibility range here so that make sure that my outline is visible at any scale, but I can see my black outline. So I'm not going to be confused about looking at data up here when it's not actually relevant to my SA2. Okay, so now that I've got my SA2 outline there and some data, let's say I'm not interested in average household size. I can actually expand this feature layer via the little drop-down arrow, and I can change what's actually being shown in each statistical area. So I'm at an SA2 level. You can see that because it's not grayed out. I'm going to hit the change style icon again, and I'm going to change the attribute being shown. And this is where I said the title of this layer is a little bit misleading. So I can click on this, and there's actually lots of data sets that exist within it. So if we go a bit more slowly, we've got unemployed population, which might be a demographic challenge for some areas. I'm not quite sure what 2020 books is and why there's 4 layers, so I haven't had a look at a lot of these, but we've got female populations that can be particularly useful for some areas as well, as can the reverse. I know it's got male populations too by age groups as well. Households by type, so family, non-family, etc. Marital status, population by education. So if I was interested in how many people have a bachelor's degree in particular SA levels, I can choose that and so forth. So you can see that there's actually a lot of data sitting within it. We just need to make sure that we choose the right attribute being shown. So let's say, and again, I'm just kind of going off the cuff. I don't know anything too much about Cooloola other than it's an aging population, but let's pretend it's a young population for the moment. And I was interested in population by education, secondary education, 10 years and above. So I can select that. And again, I want to change it to counts and amounts color. And I've now changed the data set. So I'm not going to go in and I can't classify the data this time because it's not actually my data. So you can see that there's some privileges that are removed when you're working with other people's data. But I can change the color scheme if I was interested in changing the color scheme. But once I've changed the attribute, I've changed it back to counts and amounts and I hit done. I've now got SA2 data showing, and it's not showing average household size. So it'd be important to, again, make the change with the rename. So it's now showing, what was it? Education, 10 years plus. And you can see once I've changed it there, that changes in my legend as well. And I want to just point out now, I've done that for statistical area 2. If I was to then zoom back into statistical area 1, it's actually flipped back to the average household size. So I'd need to repeat those steps for any statistical area that I'm working with. So I'd need to go back down to education, 10 years and above, and then select counts and amounts color to lock that in. So it's really important that they recognize that they might need to do that for some feature layers. But there's a demographic layer that's being shown. Another really good one for Queensland is land use. Queensland land use. This is one of my favorites for Queensland. This one's from QSpatial, which is a government data organization. And what we've got here is, if I go to my legend, I've got land use in Queensland. So different colors are representing different things. If I'm interested in my statistical area of Cooloola, I can see what's happening. For large amounts of it, if we're looking at residential and services, it's only Rainbow Beach, Tin Can Bay, and Cooloola Cove that have any real action happening in it. And if I wanted to see what was happening underneath the layer, I can make it more transparent too. So let's bring it up to 50%. And I can see the map underneath. If I wanted to take it a step further, go to base map, and I might change it to imagery so that when I zoom into Kalula Cove, for instance, might make it a bit more transparent. I can see that the red, which represents residential, I can see those houses there. And if we look back at our legend, orange is either services or transport and communication. And when I look at this orange, this looks like an airstrip. These look like some kind of nature corridors or parks or walks. We've got parks there. So if I knew that Kalula had an aging population, which I do, and I wanted to look at, okay, what services are available in the area, and I look at this orange on the map, I go, well, hang on a second. Is there stuff like aged care facilities here? And I might be prompted to go and do some further research on Google to see if there's actually an aged care facility in Kalula Cove region. Because if there isn't, that's going to be a demographic challenge that my students might find is an important thing to address in an aging population for Kalula. So we can see that there's plenty of layers out there, depending on where you are. It depends on what's available. Some states are a lot better at sharing geospatial data than others are. And my encouragement to teachers is, it might be a little bit too late for this year's assessment task, but for next year's assessment task, my encouragement is to actually jump onto ArcGIS if you are using it, and just have a look in these search for layers functions, see what data is available. And I encourage that because sometimes there's some really good data for some areas or for some states or for some cities. And then for other areas, there's quite a lack of data. So being able to specify your locations or give students locations to choose from where you know there are rich data sets available is going to be a huge advantage to them moving forward too. Likewise, I had a conversation with a teacher yesterday, and they made the point of it's really frustrating that there's no data for a particular location in Australia, and that it might be better to use another geospatial technology. And as a teacher myself, my first response is always to encourage you to use the best tool for the job. So if you think there is another geospatial technology or another mapping website out there that's showing data that you want, fantastic. Like, I encourage you to use that, and I encourage your students to use that too. So don't feel like you need to use ArcGIS necessarily. However, in saying that, ArcGIS does have thousands upon thousands of layers that have been uploaded to it that other geospatial technologies do not have. So that's where the big advantage is too. And you can bring in, like we modeled before, you can bring in your own data as a table. So if you've sourced your own data, or if they're building their own data set from a spreadsheet that they've found from a website and they've manually entered it, they can still bring that in and show it on this map too, which is of a huge benefit for them too. That's probably about it in terms of the skills that I wanted to cover for this. So if I go back to our PowerPoint slide really briefly, I think the next slide is just finishing up, but we have cleaned our data, we've imported it, and after we created a choropleth map, so we joined our features, we then styled our data in ArcGIS Online. So we chose colors, we set class sizes and how those classes were separated. And then we also found some other complementary layers that existed in ArcGIS Online already that had been uploaded by either Esri or other users. And that's a really great, I guess, skill set to have from start to finish in order to create a fairly sophisticated map. And if we just head back over, I just want to point out on the school's website, under our professional development tab, there's no reason that students or yourselves can't develop these skills yourself. So I won't point out the for teachers section so much, but under for teachers and students, we have adding and styling layers. And what we did today is we essentially cleaned that data. We added the layers from a file, and then I also showed you where to find other layers and add other layers. So I guess we've kind of gone backwards here, part 3 to part 2 to part 1, but that's all there for you to unpack. And then in terms of creating the choropleth, Under adding and styling layers, we have performing analysis. And if you remember, I clicked on the analysis button here, and I've got a little tutorial on how to create the choropleth map as well as other things that you might find useful too. So that's there, and I really want to encourage you to just remind yourself and maybe bookmark the professional development website, because there's some really great resources there to help you out. Alrighty. In finishing, we are finished about 14 minutes early, which is great for questions. So I'll just let you ask them while I unpack some of what's on this slide. And if I don't have any questions by the end of that, we'll get to call it a little bit early and head on home. But like I just pointed out, our website does have some really great learning materials, some really great professional development resources, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with them already. And I do want to encourage you that if you want to talk to me or seek additional support or unpack how you can use ArcGIS in your assessment tasks with your students, feel free to reach out to me at education@esriaustralia.com.au. And depending on where you're located, we might even be able to do a site visit, but worst case scenario, we can definitely organize a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting or a series of Teams or Zoom meetings, and we can unpack that assessment task and how we can utilize ArcGIS effectively for your students in that assessment task. Alrighty, I haven't had any questions today, which is really great, because it means that you guys are pros and you've absorbed it all. But if anything pops up in the next couple of days or whatnot, again, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to assist. By registering, you will also receive a recording of today's webinar, so you can go back and review it as well. And it will just contain a link to this, which we'll put up on YouTube for you. Otherwise, I know that it's the business end of term 2, so I thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Hopefully you found it worthwhile and you've gotten something out of it, and hopefully you can find a way to implement this in either this assessment task or in assessment tasks that are similar in the future. Thank you guys, and have a great afternoon. Bye now.